Hello, I'd like to talk to you today about a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, The South. In this story, which starts basically in 1939, we meet a character of Juan Dahlman. We know that he's of German ancestry, but that he considers himself very much from Argentina too. He had a grandfather who died struggling, fighting the Indians. He feels that his grandfather died very nobly and chooses to identify himself with this noble Argentine tradition. But he himself lives in an urban area in a big city, Buenos Aires. He works in a library. We have to point out that Borges was obsessed with libraries and that he has a rather mundane kind of life. But he is fascinated by the romanticism of his Argentinian grandfather. And from his grandfather, he's inherited this older ranch, and he dreams of going there, but he never seems to actually go there. He might have been there as a child, but as an adult, he's enamored of the idea of going there, but he never seems to really break away from the city and go live in this rural area. And as we meet him, um, we learn that he has just acquired a copy of 1001 Nights. Now, if you know 1001 Nights, it is about a beautiful bride to, I believe, a sultan who usually traditionally kills his brides after sleeping with them. The typical bride lasts one night. And she decides that she doesn't want to die, and the way she's going to stay alive is by telling these incredible, fantastic stories. And so she manages to live 1001 nights by telling these incredible stories. So it was the gift of her storytelling that kept her alive, which would appeal to Borges, but it very much appeals to Dahlman because he reaches for this book as an escape from reality. In fact, he's reading this book when he feels something he thinks maybe it's a bat or an insect against his head. In fact, he's walked into a window and cut himself. He falls very, very ill, has to be taken off to a sanitarium, and through the illness and the depth of his despair and illness, he reaches constantly for 1001 Nights. So it's his escape from pain and reality. At the same time, it kind of merges with his delirium. So he has these fantastical psychotic episodes, basically. And he's very unhappy. He's tortured in the sanitarium. They stick him with a needle, and he's in great pain, and just dreams of getting away and starts to dream of the South. And one day they tell him, in fact, that he can leave, and he decides to go off to this ranch in the South. And he has this great romantic notion of the South. Now, the South in Argentina at that time was kind of like the Wild West. Instead of cowboys, they had gauchos, very much like cowboys. They had their own code of honor, and they would fight for their honor and fight to the death, and they fought with swords. This was the time before guns, and when guns and rifles were not really common. And they were kind of like the cowboys of the West, and the South was kind of romanticized by Dahlman as being like the Wild West, and he thought of it as this great place of adventure and romanticism and healing and nothing but positive things. And as he's leaving the sanitarium to go to the train station, the city unfolds, and he describes it as being like a house at dawn with familiar corridors and rooms. And we see that as he looks at the city, first he sees it in his mind's eye, he imagines it, he remembers it, and then he actually sees it. And he gets to the train station early, and he remembers this cafe, and he goes to this cafe, and it's just like he remembered it. And there's a cat, and he talks about the cat as being kind of unreal, and how he's like touching the glass, separated from the cat by glass, and the cat is kind of an illusion. So in some ways he seems delirious, not really in the world, and that he's not all there. He doesn't have a good sense of reality. He's going on memory as much as anything else. And he gets on the train, and once again he looks at his mark at his 1001 Nights, and he thinks great happiness to imagine that. And he looks out this window and he sees the South, but it's the South of books that he's read. He can't really identify any of the plants except for through books he's read. So he has this very academic and really idealized version of the South. And he travels through the South, and they reach a small town where the train can't go any longer, and he gets out and goes into the general store and is struck by how one of the men who works in the general store really resembles one of the people who took care of him in the sanitarium, one of the nurses. But then he shakes that off and he decides to go and have something to eat. And while there, he's insulted. Someone throws a spit wad at him and they insult his character. And he's basically thrown a knife by the old gaucho. And this old gaucho is kind of like the mythic Martin Fierro, which is in fact mentioned in this book, this consummate gaucho who had written, there's a long book of epic poetry about the life of Martin Fierro, a gaucho in Argentina. And so this gaucho, this cowboy is very much like the mythic Martin Fierro, and he gives him a knife, and he understands that he has to go out and fight for his life, and he's only read about fighting with knives. He, once again, is kind of an ineffectual bureaucrat who's never really lived in the country and doesn't really know the ways of the South except for through books, which are romanticized. And he goes out and he has this image and he thinks, well, this is how I would have died if I could have chosen how to die. This is how I would die. I'd much rather die this way than die back in that old sanitarium. Die for my honor, a good and honest fight in a beautiful summer evening deep in the South. And he goes out and we know he's going to die. So Borges and others have suggested that in fact he had died, that he had never left the sanitarium, that he had been so tortured in the sanitarium that his mind had sought escape. And all of that dreamlike trip down to the train station and the trip to the cafe with the black cat and this trip to the small town and the people he met, even his eventual death, were in fact a dream, that he was still in the sanitarium dreaming, and that he was dreaming of the way he'd like to die, death with honor, death with dignity, not the ignoble kind of humiliation of wasting away in a sanitarium and being strapped down and tortured by doctors, but a dignified life, like his grandfather had died, being killed for his honor. So I think the South is really a story about a man's dreams and how his dreams bring him honor. So it's Freudian in the sense the dream is a wish fulfillment. And much of that episode where he does dream of leaving the hospital is kind of a surreal dream. So it fits very much within the modernist tradition. Thank you.